consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview David Rahimi, a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Texas in Austin, to talk about his research on the development of Iran's consumer capitalist economy, looking specifically at the time frame of 1941 to 1979. David, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dakota.
So can you start by just telling people a little bit about your topic, giving a cursory overview, thinking in terms of, for example, the time frame, the geography, the context around which your topic is happening, and just talk about some of your arguments. And, that can include things like Mohammad, Reza, Shah, who you talk about, the coup of 1953, etc.
Yeah, so I work on, my primary research focuses on modern Iran, mostly in the 20th century. And my purpose of my dissertation is to kind of interrogate and narrate the growth of consumer capitalism in Iran under Mohammad Reza Shah, who reigned from 1941 till 1979, where many people might be familiar with the famous Islamic Revolution that brought Ayatollah Khomeini and the current Islamic Republic of Iran to power. And my goal is to try and understand how consumerist capitalist society, culture, and structures kind of formed during this period, and that they kind of took a dip and hit during the 1980s with the Iran-Iraq war that lasted for most of that decade, and then came back to life in the later 1990s. And my goal in this is mainly because there's kind of an absence of literature regarding our understanding of what consumerism looked like during this period. How were people interacting with consumable goods? What did they think of them? How did these kind of modern forms of consumption even take shape? A lot of research has focused on large-scale industries, big pharmaceuticals, steel, coal, things like that, which the state was heavily interested in. And a lot of these previous economic studies of this period have focused on trying to tie economic issues to the eventual revolution. And in our field of Iranian history, there's been a pushback of late against just writing the story of the 1940s to the 1970s as a prelude to the revolution, where we all sort of know there is a revolution going to happen. All of the stories we tell about these decades are just build up to that moment. So all of the arguments sort of have a tautological bent to them, where this eventuality is going to happen and we know it, and it's kind of determined already. That kind of seeps into the narratives. But what I want to do is kind of write a more grounded, low-level investigation of who are the people trying to build consumer capitalist structures, and that can be anything from trying to improve agricultural products, livestock, canning products, to how do you create a mass market book industry? Like, that doesn't just happen overnight. And that was kind of the thing that motivated me to start this study. Was a lot of people sometimes just take it for granted in economic history that or like in social studies, they'll just say, oh, and then there was the diffusion of large scale goods and like consumer products proliferated or something like that. But these things don't just suddenly appear out of nowhere. Someone has to build these, has to be distribution networks. And for those of us living through COVID right now, we are all beginning to feel exactly what that means with the delays at shipping ports, the disruptions to distribution networks, whether that be for food production or for Christmas gifts, because the trucking industry is in great disorder. All of these things matter greatly for how mass consumer society takes form. And so I wanted to investigate that in detail and show how that forms, and also push against an idea that has been prevalent in our field, that all these things were negative. All the Iranians reacted badly to this as forms of westernization. There's a famous phrase that's coined in this period called "garbs a day," which means West toxification, or being kind of West, like it's compared to a disease where you're just sort of overly enamored with anything Western, and it results in kind of gross imitations. But that's not really what happens once you get past the polemics and some of the ideological critiques that emerged in this period and carried on in later decades. What you see is a lot of adaptation on the part of Iranians, you see some pushback as well, but it's mostly this in-between ambiguous and contradictory things of some parts of consumer capitalism are good, some other parts are bad, some things we just don't know what to do with. And that kind of guides the whole research as we move through several case studies, because it's very hard to narrate a story of how consumer capitalism grows. And that was one of the challenges of this project, and something I found interesting to try and do. Like if you're writing a political history of any country for that matter, you can go to you can go look at see what governments did. You can go and be like, here are like public statements, here are like the documents of the State Department or the Foreign Office if you're in Britain or something like that. There are clear documents and archives you go to find information of what countries are doing to each other. And those are regularly kept and maintained. For consumer capitalism, you kind of have to piece together things of there's no one writing, like collecting documents of like, and here's how we build structures that results in the mass consumer society that you see around you today. And so that's why I decided to take kind of a case study approach to the situation. So the research, as I said, kind of focuses on Iran, 1941, 1979, this under Mohammad Reza Shah. And I break up the project into these case studies that move from the state level, kind of a broad general overview, and then get into microscopic details and then pull back again to show the broad picture. So we start with interstate relations between the United States and the Iranian government in the 1950s, working on agriculture through Truman's Point 4 program. And Point 4 is similar to the Marshall Plan. People may have heard of the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. Less well known as the Point 4 program of Truman, which is basically the Marshall Plan, but for everyone else who's not in Europe. And Iran was one of the largest operations and the first one that they had, actually. And so I focused in on that program, their work in agricultural modernization. That's to give a sense of the importance of interstate cooperation, tensions, as the two governments try to work together to modernize society, and what the expectations and assumptions that each are bringing to the table, and how well they succeeded or did not in those endeavors. And then from there, we move into the space between the public and private sectors, because NGOs are actually very important in developing countries. Some people might be familiar with literature nowadays in political science about NGOs, works kind of like microbanking and things like that. The same is true in Iran and developing countries right after World War II, where you don't have a large scale private industry to begin with, or it was damaged heavily during the war that preceded. And so I focus on this book NGO, the Franklin Book Programs, which was an American NGO, but their interesting thing about them was that their staff, they were entirely staffed by indigenous employees. So there's no Americans operating in Iran or any of the Asian countries in which they operated in as well. It's all run by indigenous employees with hands-off American control, which gives us a really good insight to see how local people kind of try to take control of the advice, training, and mechanisms that the Americans provide to try and promote mass consumption of books. And so that involved having to try and modernize the paper industry, printing, and also the marketing of books in general, as well as storefronts. And then from there, we move into back, we kind of pull, after kind of like digging deeply into the nitty gritty of that, we pull back and look at advertising on a large scale, because you need to be able to market your goods in some way, promote them. So we look at advertising. And then finally, the last thing that I address is that capitalism, consumer capitalism is never just about, free markets are never entirely free. It's basically the point I'm trying to make here in this final chapter. Because if you think about it, we have certain laws and regulations, contract enforcement being one of them, to prevent people from just kind of doing whatever they want. Also, there are certain goods that we forbid people from selling. as like public harms and whatnot. So we have the most well known, of course, we have the FDA now that regulates food and health and drugs. We also, and so the same, so to get a sense of what consumer capitalism looks like in a society, you have to look and see how it's constantly shaped and formed by what people are choosing to, as one scholar kind of calls it, framing out. What is not acceptable consumption in a society? Because that defines what capitalism looks like there as well. And so that chapter, we look at kind of the wig industry and the way the wig black market kind of works. I look at book piracy and copyright law to look at the debates around how Iranians are evading copyright to try and get their hands on published material elsewhere, and the arguments that they're making for why that's acceptable or not acceptable, and the ways that Franklin and others are trying to stop that. And then I also look at cases of prostitution and female commodification in advertising and consumer sectors more broadly, because the state kind of ends up with a very ambivalent attitude to certain forms of consumption that are thread the line between morally questionable and apprehensible and, well, this is a modern practice that occurs in other countries around the world, so it should be acceptable if we're a modern country as well. This is the case when it comes to cabarets, which have an association with prostitution at this time. And so there's a lot of critiques and condemnation in the press about that. But at the same time, both the cabarets themselves and the government see them as these modern consumer spaces. And so cabarets will promote themselves as kind of glitzy modern establishments that have precedents and analogous institutions in France and Europe. And they'll bring foreign talent from abroad to show like, yes, this is a normal, high class, modern, respectable kind of entertainment and leisurely space in which we all enjoy, while trying to fend off the concerns about prostitution and improper and immoral behavior at the same time from others. And so that's kind of where the dissertation leaves off as well. So the overarching argument then is that through these decades, Iran, with the cooperation of foreign countries, most prominently the United States, but then later on Germans, the French, Japanese companies as well, really heavily invests in modernizing itself. And a lot of this, the important stuff takes place away from the state. The state is very interested in its large-scale modernization projects, dams, heavy industry, but a lot of what kind of lasts after the Mohammad Reza Shah period, besides like the dams and some of these things, are these smaller, slower changes that occur in specific industries, whether that's in agriculture and changing people's attitudes about using battery chickens and getting them off of chickens that they had been like bred chickens to instead go to a mass consumer form, or to changing the way that a book market functions in creating the necessary institutions, paper mills, printing presses that can allow for mass consumerism to flourish later on in research, and also creating the advertising mechanisms for native companies that grow in the 1950s. And all of these survive both the revolution and the 1980s to come back and resurge in the 1990s. And so that's kind of the large argument that this dissertation is making.
I want to spend a little time talking about Iran on the micro level, but before we go into that, can you just give a little more detail to who Mohammad Reza Shah is and sort of how he plays into this story of modernization and consumer capitalism?
Yeah, so Mohammad Reza Shah is the second Pahlavi king. His father, Reza Khan Shah, had come to power in the 1920s after a period of turmoil in Iran in the 1910s. He's a military man with ties to the British. So he comes to power, makes himself king in the 1920s. And then in World War II, the British and the Russians are concerned that Iran has a lot of ties in the 1930s to Nazi Germany. And they're worried that Iran and the king might close off an important corridor between the British and the Americans and the Soviet Union for war supplies and also oil. And so they can't get a firm response out of him, so they decide to invade the country, depose him, and put his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, who was a young man at the time, onto the throne. And he in the 1940s is still kind of feeling out his position as a ruler, because he doesn't come in with a lot of backing. He's clearly backed by Soviets, Americans, and the British. And he doesn't want to push his luck a little bit at this point. And then that fades away as we get into the oil crisis of the 1950s, when oil is nationalized in Iran, leads to the famous 1953 coup, where the CIA deposes the Iranian prime minister, Mohammad, and the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, uses this moment to solidify his power. And he starts to think himself sort of invincible because of the American coup that brought him back into power. And so he decides to kind of start trying to remake Iran in the modern image that he has. And he's been heavily influenced by his studies abroad in Europe, and his contacts with American and other foreign technical advisors, that Iran needs to be a great and powerful nation. We need to modernize it along Western lines. We achieved something similar to what Japan did in the pre-war period of modernizing itself, making itself independent of foreign powers and stuff like that. And so his kind of vision guides a lot of these modernization efforts and provides a fertile social and political context for them.
So thinking about this is a two-part question. So I'll start by asking the first part. Can you talk a little bit about what the development of consumer capitalism looked like on a micro level? Like here in the US, and most of my listeners being from the US, when they think about the, emergence of consumer capitalism, particularly after World War II, they think of, these big, bright Coca-Cola ads and, advertisements that sort of showcase extravagance and luxury, both in the imagined space, that is, of advertising, and in reality. What did consumer capitalism look like if you were just an average person living in Iran?
Yeah, so it goes through stages. So in the 1940s, it looks pretty like advertising is mostly just like hand-drawn images. You don't, at this point, really have a lot of public images of women, which is famous American and Western advertising, because you have these social taboos and also legal restrictions against public displays of women's bodies in a heavily Muslim country. And then also you're just recovering from the absolute devastation and famine of the war years. So advertising is very limited to like a few luxury goods here and there, both in the imagined space of advertising and in actual reality. Although you do have a surplus of American consumables at this point, because the U.S. Army leaves a ton of material behind when it departs Iran at the end of the war. And so you have like weird things Iranians sometimes like adapt these things into like little gimmicks. So there's like a famous like yogurt product during this period where they just basically take Mickey Mouse and slap it onto like the label for this new yogurt product that they have. So you get weird amalgamations like that occur. But it's really in the mid 60s and later 70s as oil wealth starts to take off in Iran that heavy investment begins, and you see more people having access to consumer products in actual reality, and also the advertising proliferates heavily. But the country, it's important to like remember a lot of the people are still very poor, and this is one of the like points of contention in Iranian history like right now, is how much did actual like consumer products and culture trickle down to your ordinary person? And it's a hard thing to sort of measure depending on what you expect that to look like. So one scholar argues that the vast majority, especially of like rural people, had like no interaction whatsoever with these like new modern consumer cultures, whether in like advertising or in actual reality. And what I've sort of found is that might not be the case as much as we think, because we do have evidence that foreign travelers or teachers working abroad through Fulbright scholarships and stuff, through their memoirs, that rural Iranians and lower class Iranians, poor workers, did interact with consumable goods in various ways, whether that was through kind of taking junk that other people threw out and kind of reappropriating it for themselves and kind of making do, or they would work in as like house guests or cooks or something for a middle or upper class person, and so be exposed to new technologies and goods in those houses and environments. And other times, they might share certain modern products. So even in like very poor shanty towns in southern Tehran, which is like the abject power, people are living out of like former brick furnaces. People, and sometimes and other times in alleyways, people would pass around, like one person would somehow save enough money, like the slightly better off poor person would acquire an iron, and then they would all share that. And then they would siphon electricity off illegally from richer neighborhoods around their area. So there are all these various ways that even poor people and rural migrants to cities find ways to interact with these new cultures, even if they don't necessarily have the money to pay for it. And then there's also the important like aspirational effect of that advertising provides, of this is what you should aspire to. And I think what we see in the 1990s kind of proves the point that like that was even if a lot of people couldn't participate readily in the 60s and 70s because of poverty and income inequality, that aspiration worked. When we get to the 90s, people want these goods that didn't go away, and it remains strong. So perhaps the most lasting legacy is what I argue, is that this discourse of abundance, that we can create abundance and you can have it too. That's what is probably the greatest lasting achievement of these decades.
The second part of this question that I have deals with the limits of consumer capitalism in Iran. So not to conflate different parts of the Middle Eastern world together, but for example, when I think about the development of consumer capitalism in the Middle East, and a lot of people might think about this because it was recent, how in Saudi Arabia, only recently movie theaters became legal. And there have been certain more liberal reforms that have been taking place there that have allowed women to be displayed more in advertising and all of these different things. How restrictive was it in Iran, and were there certain limitations that are similar to that we've seen in Saudi Arabia previously?
Yeah, so I would say Iran. Saudi Arabia is like the most extreme case because it's got Wahhabist influences in its Islamic structure, and the religious establishment had greater leeway during the same time period in the 1940s and 1970s to kind of enforce strict interpretations. In Iran during this period, the Shah, mostly a secular, what we would call a secular Muslim today, and isn't quite dependent on the religious establishment, and becomes increasingly hostile to the religious establishment as he feels secure in his power in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so there's a greater space for for kind of liberal, what we see as like Western liberalism in consumer capitalism and in advertising. So women's images, bodies become easily publicly displayed, regardless of whether there's a lot of people complaining about that. They're allowed to do so. And then, so like once you get to like the mid 50s onwards, it's not unusual to find women's bodies, and increasingly in the 60s and 70s, very sexualized depictions of them. So you'd think that you were just looking at magazines from Italy or France or something like that. And in fact, Italian B movies are very popular in Iran at the time. And so, and this is true for cinema as well at the time. Iranian cinema is one of the strongest Middle Eastern cinema fields, both at that time and today. And it had a thriving market for that. So you had people, that was probably one of the most easiest forms of consumption for people across socioeconomic spectrums, was going to films, and Iranians went to films in the thousands and millions. In terms of restrictions, it was a weird cat and mouse game of like pushing the limits, because officially on the books, there were laws again to protect public morality, but they were very vague about what that meant. So there was technically, so in the case of prostitution, there's no law saying that prostitution is illegal. There are just laws that condemn anything that like goes against public chastity. What that means can vary depending on the state's needs. So there was a well-known large red light district in basically the center of Tehran but no one ever shut it down. And occasionally there would be raids, occasionally there would be programs to like help rehabilitate prostitutes. But you had police at like the gates to like regulate who come in and out very loosely. But otherwise they left it alone for the most part, despite supposedly trying to public morality. And the same thing goes for films. Occasionally, like they were supposed to censor films for indecent conduct and depictions. Sometimes those just like slipped through because the censors like either didn't care or just didn't notice. And so then people would throw a fit in the press, and then the censors would go back and edit it out. So you have this dynamic interplay between the society and the state to kind of censor and regulate public morality and what that means.
Thinking about what's happening maybe more in academic or religious circles, where was there a notable group of socialists or communists living in Iran that were vehemently opposed to the consumer capitalism, or were there religious conservatives that were speaking out against it? Like, was there this dialogue going on between people who were advocating for these consumer capitalist reforms and a reaction against it, like I said, from religious circles or circles of communists and socialists?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes. So there was a very strong, the formal Communist Party of Iran, the Tudeh Party, was effectively destroyed early on in like the 40s and 50s, especially after the 1953 coup. They used that moment to basically like finally like destroy that organization. But communist ideas, leftist influences persist heavily and take on new shapes and sizes. And you also get guerrilla movements that are constantly attacking the state, literally at this time with guns. But they're in dialogue with third world movements at the time. They're very well up to date on other conversations coming out of the Soviet Union, China, and other countries about, and also the Arab world, about capitalism, imperialism, kind of what they see as like third world oppression. And one of the most famous like leftist critics at the time, Ali Shariati, who's also, in Iran, you get an interesting mixture of leftism combined with Shia Islam to form this kind of hybrid critique. And he lists advertising alongside imperialism and a score of other ills that are like the bane of human society and that will lead to the ultimate downfall of civilization. So he and others clearly see kind of modern advertising and consumerism as a threat to a thriving community and society. And they're in dialogue somewhat with religious conservatives, although some of the more conservative ones would see these leftists as godless infidels because they don't believe in God, for some of them. So that would hamper relations as well, and so that would allow them to ally with the state against leftists at times. But they share some of the similar concerns that what we're seeing with modern consumerism and capitalism is a degradation of community values, public morality. It's harming our women, it's causing our men to sin, and it's upending our traditional values and lifestyles, and leading to a degradation not only of our, also the environment as well. So you'll see some religious publications complaining about the rampant pollution that starts to form in Iran, because Tehran, sort of like Mexico City, for some listeners who may be familiar with Mexico City's pollution problems because of the mountains, traps a lot of that smog inside. And the same thing happens with Tehran with the Alborz Mountains to the north. So you see some of these shared critiques as well along the line. So yes, there's a very vocal both leftist and religious critiques of these. Although some do try to reach out across the line and reconcile modern consumerism, capitalism, lifestyles with religious piety. So you do see some Shi'i clerics trying to reconcile these and bridge the gaps and find kind of a happy medium.
So if you'd be able to comment before we wrap up, if you'd be able to comment on talking about Iran in today's times, in 2021, does consumer capitalism still play a prevalent role in the lives of citizens there? And, consumer capitalism being seen, as you've described, as being this sort of Western import. I wonder if, Trump's economic restrictions, his it's not the word's not tariffs, it's
The embargoes?
right, Trump's embargoes on Iran has that.
Oh, the sanctions regime and stuff like that.
Right. Have the sanctions played a role on changing people's views of Western notions of capitalism, or if you could talk about that and talk about just sort of like what the economic situation looks like now, if those embargoes are still in place, if they are, what does the economic situation look like? If they're not, how has this changed Iran for better or worse?
Yeah, so I'll try to be brief about that. The sanctions are still a lot. I mean, there are lots of different types of sanction regimes that are in place. Some have been pulled back a little bit, but most of the economic ones are still in place that have been since the 80s and the 90s. There was a bit of a slight fall in the 90s, but then they were returned once a hardline regime reemerged. The taste for consumerism is still prevalent in Iran today. What the sanctions have done in many ways is just forced Iranians to be more creative of how they access goods, and also to complain mostly about unfair treatment from Western restrictions and stuff like that, and sometimes to complain to the government about its mishandling and of either nuclear negotiations, which the sanctions are largely tied to nowadays, as well as Iran's funding for terrorist-listed organizations that the organizations the U.S. considers to be terrorists. So what Iran, so it's kind of forced Iranians to be very creative in getting their goods. So, but like few people are calling for an end to consumerism in Iran. So like a good example of this is the large desire for satellite TVs. Technically, the state considers these illegal, and every so often there are sweeps to get rid of the satellite antennae and dishes on people's houses. But most of the time, it's just left. People are left alone. As long as we don't see it, there's no problem. But lots of people buy these satellite TVs so that they can access foreign television programming and entertainment. You have lots of large-scale industries that promote tourism. Some of these are owned by state entities as well. None of them are calling for an end to consumerism. The government tries to position itself. Whenever you get a new government elected in Iran, they're all marching on a platform of we can fix the economy, we can make it better, we can provide a higher standard of living, which was the same promise that Truman's Point 4 program brought in the 1950s, and that Iranians quickly adopted as well. I guess the other thing I would say is that what this research and other research shows is that consumer capitalism isn't a completely Western import, because similar ideas and sensibilities already exist in Iran before the Americans show up, before the West even arrives, because Islam, going back to the Prophet Mohammad, is a merchant. Private property, considered one of the critical ingredients by many of capitalism, is religiously a very protected right, and so it's easier for that to kind of take hold than in some places that might not have such greater protections for private property. And so Iranians are already ready to adapt, adopt, and kind of own these ideas and make them their own. So they're willing cooperators who sympathize with these ideas, and they came to them on their own as well. But yeah, today in Iran, consumer capitalism is alive and well. The sanctions regime has just made it hard to access goods. If we think our supply chain problems are a nightmare, the Iranians are far worse. And so there are shortages constantly of everything from electricity to recently there was a huge uproar where a bunch of chicken farmers dumped a bunch of chicken carcasses out in front of a municipal building in protest a year or so ago because of electricity problems. There was an electricity blackout, and because they didn't have the energy, a bunch of their chickens died in the facilities. And so the sanctions regime has drastically hit most like ordinary Iranians' abilities to access foodstuffs, medicines, and has made life extremely difficult. In the hope, according to the people those who like create sanctions, that this will put pressure on society to pressure the government to abandon nuclear research and other things that the United States and their allies consider deviant foreign policy practices.
Before we wrap up, if you can just recommend one or two books on the economic history or political history of Iran that you think would be useful for people to read if they're interested in going beyond what we've talked about in this podcast.
Yeah, sure. So I will recommend first book I have on my shelf. I can recommend this volume by Abbas Amanat, a prominent professor. It's Iran, a Modern History. And it provides an excellent overview of modern Iranian history all the way up to the 1990s and early 2000s, roughly. And so for anyone who's interested and it's got an excellent bibliography and further reading sections in there, which is always invaluable to readers who might want to know, well, okay, where should I look next? Or I'm interested in a particular topic. You can find that in the table of contents, go to that chapter, read that, then be like, okay, here's where I should look for like more specific studies on my topic that really interests me. So I would recommend this as Abbas Amanat book as a good general introduction to modern Iranian history, something that's easily readable, it's meant for non-specialists, can really introduce you to Iran. On the topic of consumer capitalism in Iran, I guess I have two book recommendations. If you're interested in housing and what it looks like in the home life of women and stuff, Iranian women in this period, there's a book by Pamela Karimi. I can show you this one as well. A very boring cover, but it masks the fact that it's a very interesting book about domesticity and consumer culture in Iran from the Qajars in the late 19th century up to the present day in the Islamic Republic. And that looks at everything from a way that the interiors of houses have been changed to fit new consumer technologies, to the way that this has impacted the lives of women. So I would recommend that. But if you're more interested today, like music, there's an excellent book by G.J. Braley that looks at popular music in Iran across the 20th century and early 21st century. So if you're interested in popular music trends, I would look at that book as well. It's a fascinating study. They do a lot of in-depth interviews with musicians and go into details about how they organize events and stuff like that.
Great, David. Thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Jeff, thank you for having me.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.